Welcome to Mitchoy Chats. I'm Michael J. Foy.
I am Frank Mitchell.
I'm Mike DeJoya.
And tonight we'll be discussing something a little different, something a little fun. Doing a list of, Frank, this was your idea. What was your exact name for this? I feel like you had a way of laying it out.
Well, the most rudimentary way I can say it is top 5 horror flicks. But what I wanted to get at with with you guys making these lists was basically like, look, we all get, if you were to make a top 10 like albums of all time, it would be like, the Beatles' White Album and like, you know what I mean? Like the standard stuff that everyone's like, yes, this is great. But like, I'm not looking for the standard list of greats. So that's kind of my thought process with this list is I'm not looking for the great horror movies. I'm looking for horror movies that really like struck you in your home or in your heart, if for lack of a better term. A couple like 5 horror movies that really like were formative for you, or ones that like you always think about when you're like, that is horror. Like that is something that sticks out to me in my brain when I think about horror. And that's pretty much the whole idea of this top 5 horror list was basically like movies that hit home for you in a horror sense. That's really what I was going for here.
Sure. Go ahead, Mike.
No, I was going to say it's funny because like what you said like makes a lot of sense. Like trying to find like horror movies that just are not necessarily the best, the ones that kind of just hit you a certain way. And that was kind of the tough thing about this, because some of those movies I watched when I was young are those like more, known horror movies. It's like, God, that really did hit me a certain way though when I watched it. So it was a tough list to make, and I don't know if I would say like these are the top 5 for me, but there's definitely 5 in there that encompass like, the horror movies I do love. So it'll be interesting to talk about them and see what everyone says.
Yeah, I'm excited because like the ones I have, like I'm looking at them and I'm like, these could easily be called pieces of shit. Like, you know what I mean? These would be like, oh my God, like we get it. You like trash. Like, and I think that's another thing is I mentioned before we started this podcast, or before we started recording tonight, that recording Mitchoy Chats and more importantly Mike Foy has been instrumental in my horror knowledge and education expansion as of like 2011 when we started doing this podcast. Because there's a number of things I've seen as of late and like later in my life that I didn't see early on that had an interesting effect on me that I feel like it would have had way more of an effect on me if I saw them earlier. So it was just interesting when some of these movies landed for me. But
I'm just glad that we were able to get you to really find a love and appreciation for more horror movies.
I used to be so fucking terrified. Like in making this list, I wrote a note to myself here that I was like, boy, you really never had an idea that like horror could be silly or self-aware or campy or anything like that. Like it took me a while. I was like maybe like 14 or 15 when I was finally like, oh, they know what they're doing and they know that it's kind of funny and silly. Okay. All right. Okay. Like, because before that, I'm like, this is terrifying. Like, these are horrifying times. Like, I remember even talking about You're Next, where like there were moments that Mike Foy was like, "Oh yeah, I was laughing about this reference and this reference," and I'm like, "How can you laugh about these things?" Like, you know what I mean? I'm like, this old
Frank,
woman. You know what I mean? Like,
I remember that conversation, and I
Right?
remember Mike DeJoy and I talking about your next in the moment that the girl gets the blender on her head, and
oh
we
man,
started laughing at how it's purely absurd, and it's like it's played to be heightened and ridiculous, and the look on your face, I will never forget it. You were like, "What the fuck are you talking about?"
that is so
You're like,
funny
"That was
because,
horrific."
because thinking about it now, I'm like, I love watching Your Next, and when the blender moment happens, like we always laugh because it's so ridiculous. But like,
It's just so good. It's so well
love
executed. Like,
I love that you guys remember that because I'll think about that sometimes. I'm like, clutch your fucking pearls, Frank. Like, shut the fuck up. Like, you know what I mean? Like, oh, it's too funny. But in any case, yeah, that was a little realization I had when I was making this list. And it's evident with it. But yeah, go back and listen to Your Next. That's on MitchoyChats.com. Check out all our old stuff. But
please do. MitchoyChats.com. It's fucking great.
And I think the other important thing here, at least for my list, is that when we say top 5, this is not like number 5, number 4, and now our number 1 is. It's like this is just 5. It was hard enough coming up with 5. Don't make me number them. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Totally fair. Who would like to go first?
I'll no, I've been talking for a while. I'll wait.
Mike DeJoy.
Yeah, I'll pick one first for sure.
Cool.
So I'm going to throw out for the first one. Again, like you said, Frank, this is random, not number ordered at all. So I'm going to I have to throw out the original Evil Dead.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I have to go with this one. Now, typically, like when I watch, I love the whole trilogy. I loved, 1, 2, and 3. And if I really had to pick one, in a lot of ways, I would always like venture to 2. I love 2. Like that's just the great horror comedy of all time. But just kind of talking about horror movies, though, like Evil Dead really was a nasty little piece. And Evil Dead 2, again, like I said, plays more like horror comedy, where this is more of a straight horror movie. And this movie felt like, the confidence that was made, like with this, even with its budget, like Sam Raimi hit us with something that, again, this was 1981, so we had never really seen anything as graphic and maniacal. I mean, this was just such a maniacal movie, especially if you look at like the last 20 minutes, especially.
What a term. What a term. I have to just jump in here. That's a great term. Yeah. No, it's great.
That's what it is. Like, you see Bruce Campbell, like watching all this happen. And like, not only that, it's one of those movies too, that it happens in like this dark corner of the world. No one's around. But at the same time, there's like global implications to what's going on. And I always kind of found that like very interesting, even like when you watch something like The Omen and they talk about like, the purpose of Damien and all this, like it's happening in like this, like small, it's happening somewhere like that. No one knows what's going on, but there's like global implications to what can happen if this gets loose, and that's something that the first Evil Dead, that's one of the aspects that I thought was really like scary about that. And there's a lot of horror movies like that too, but like I always like that idea of like something happening like in this. Yeah,
it's like ground zero, and it's like it's not happening anywhere else. And if it does happen here, it's gonna happen elsewhere.
Exactly, and like you imagine like what you saw happen in that cabin, you kind of imagine it on that. Like, can you imagine seeing that just unleashed on the entire world? So that's what kind of like made that really scary. So for as much of a low budget movie as it was, it really succeeded in putting that concept out there. And Joy,
I do want to interject because you've set this up beautifully. The original Evil Dead is also on my list.
Okay. I figured there'd be some crossover here. So you said the first one, right? First one's on your list?
Yeah. So what I tried to Like when Frank threw this idea, I liked this idea. I thought it was an interesting, sort of like top 5 list to make, and trying to think of movies that like really impacted me in a way and made just an unremarkable impression. And Evil Dead was one of those movies. I saw Evil Dead when I was like, I don't know, 9.5 or 10, and
yeah, same here.
Holy shit, did that movie fuck with me. Like, I loved it, but it was also, like, downright terrifying. And I saw it, just very similar to Mike DeJoya here. Like, this would have been, 1995, probably 1996, more than likely. And,
Wow.
like, this was a movie that was made in 1981. It's low budget, but when you're watching movies at that time, like, this is 25-year difference, 27-year difference or whatever. Like, just the effects didn't look so dated. Things didn't look as dated. And to a 10-year-old kid popping an Evil Dead from fucking Video Den, I had no idea what to expect. I had no clue. And I was the type of kid who was just allowed to, as long as it didn't scare me and it wasn't like, straight up porn or something, my parents would normally let me watch it. And unsupervised, which I don't understand to this day, but I was in my fucking basement playroom watching fucking Evil Dead by myself and was just like, I can't go outside ever again.
Praying to God that like there's no like cellar door that you didn't uncover down there.
Also,
just strange tapes.
Right.
Keep in mind too, like Mike and I mean, we all kind of grew up in the woods too, so like
100%. We moved from Haledon to Ringwood.
Is that? But we were in the woods.
I moved to the
streetlights anywhere. There's no nothing. We're in the woods, and that's that.
Yeah.
Right. And Mike Foy was on the water.
Did I lose you?
No.
Oh yeah.
Mike Foy was on the water. Like it was bad. Like he was right there.
I had all the trappings.
Exactly. You were ready to go, man.
And
oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, you continue with that thought.
Oh, I was just going to say, I just was absolutely captivated by that movie, and it was a movie that always stuck with me. Like, there were so many other movies that I saw that made an impression on me. Like, there's no question. But a movie like Evil Dead, like, you see that at that age, like, you just, man, I don't know. It just gave me such a interesting and bizarre interpretation of going to like a cabin for the weekend with your friends, and like
9 years old. Holy shit!
Just looking out into like being like in the woods in general. But like if you're in the woods at night, then it's like you start thinking about that movie and you start thinking about all that imagery, and it's like a night that never ends. You put yourself in that position. If anything like that was even remotely happening, beyond terrifying. Like it's some fucked up shit, and it's looking a little dated today, no doubt about it. But it's still a wild fucking ride.
Yes, but no. I mean, it's as effective, like in so many ways more than a lot of horror, like modern horror movies that have come out over the past 20 years. Evil Dead still, even with its budgets, and like I'll never forget. Like the thing with that was like I had a buddy growing up, and we watched all those movies, and I remember going to the video store, and that had the NC-17 rating on it, and like we just looked at that NC because we watched a lot of stuff. A lot of R-rated horror at like probably a younger age than we should have. But anyway, like we would look at that NC-17 rating and like look at each other and just be like, this is what we've been waiting for. This is what we need to see. And, again, I was probably around that age too, watching the movie for the first time. So some of the sequences in that film are just...
oh, yeah. You don't look at trees the same way again.
But not at all. And it's funny too, because what really made me like, in a lot of ways, love this movie even more is that when I was working years later, I was working at the video store, and it was like around close to closing time. And somebody comes in, a girl probably around, I would say like 17, 18 years old or whatever, comes in and she's like, oh, do you have a horror movie to recommend by any chance? And I'm kind of like going through the horror movies or whatever. And I'm like, oh, Evil Dead caught my eye. I'm like, this is one of the best. I'm like, this right here is one of the best movies, one of the best horror movies. And she's like, oh, that's great. And she takes the movie and she checks out. And a couple days later, she comes back in and slams that movie on the counter. And she's like, don't ever recommend a movie to me again. And I didn't think to myself, I didn't think to myself like, oh, this is one of the great ones. Like, I'm sure she'll love it. I didn't even think I was just like I just thought very I didn't even say to myself, oh, she's probably going to hate me for this. I was like, no, this is great.
No qualifying questions. No, hey, what horror movies do you like? Just like, you know what? This one's good.
She said that and left. And I was by myself in the video store and I was just like, I love this fucking movie. I was like, just like, fuck yeah. And
what else can you say about that? What else?
You put it on right then, didn't you?
It's so perfect. It's so funny.
It was just.
What else do you do?
It was such a great moment, and so like that's why like I just had to put this movie on the list. Like I had to put the first Evil Dead. Like again, seeing it at the age I saw it at, I rewatch the movie every single year. Like I said, I'll stand by that term maniacal. It was just gritty and dirty and the effects. I mean, like as dated as the effects might even look, you see the work that went into them, and because of like the insanity of like the zombies, like
they're called the Evil Dead.
The Evil Dead. Even like the effects. They still make sense, even though they're dated. It's like this still makes sense. It's such a crazy there's such an insanity.
When you get to that moment when Linda comes out of that bedroom and is sitting in the doorway just laughing at him, it doesn't matter how silly she looks because she's supposed to have like this exaggerated makeup. That's fucking terrifying. Your friend comes in and he's like bleeding to death. You're trying to save his fucking life, and she's just laughing maniacally at you. And then starts singing, and her eyes are just completely white. Oh God.
Yeah, no, it's brutal. It's a brutal film, and it's still one of the greats, and it'll always be one of my favorites. And yeah, Evil Dead.
Nice.
1. Mm-hmm.
Damn. Well, that's one for each of you boys. I'm gonna throw one in here, and it's one we've discussed on the podcast before, specifically between me and Mike Foy. But Tales from the Hood is is on my list.
I think I saw Tales from the Hood a very, very long time ago.
It's so funny because like it came out in '95.
It's been a while. It would be like watching it for the first time again if I saw it.
It's really interesting because like I remember I have vivid memories of watching this movie, and there are some like it's a what's that the word I'm looking for, an anthology movie. It's got several little stories wrapped around a main story, and they're all based around scary stories from the hood, quote unquote, that was made in 1995. So take that with a grain of salt. But I think the stories that they told, I was a young impressionable boy. We lived in Jersey City for a little while, so I had this child sense of like inner city issues. So there was this understanding of sort of like, when we lived in Jersey City, we went to school in Wayne. In Wayne, New Jersey. We went to school where my grandmother was working at a church. So we would wake up and go from Jersey City to the church every morning, and then go to school from there. But we lived in Jersey City, and on the weekend we would hang out there. One night we would go to the Newport Center Mall where we lived, like around the block from. And there were just these moments in Tales from the Hood that I'm like, oh my God, I'm living around the corner from that. And now, like thinking about it now, I'm like, dude, you had like no understanding of what was going on or any of the nuances of inner city problems, or even understanding that Jersey City is not an inner city. So many things, but just I feel like the childlike pressure of thinking about those things and then watching a movie like this, like I'm on edge going like, there's a race war outside my window. None of it's happening, but and none of that speaks to the veracity of the film. This is just my own personal, experience with it, which is why I'm talking about it, because I feel like these movies are only going to make any sense if we talk about our personal connections to them. But it was something that it gave me fears to think about that I never really gave any thought to. Things like policemen not being on your side, which is a thought that, like, as a kid, you're like, of course the policemen are there to protect you. But then there's one story in it specifically that deals with policemen being dishonest and someone dying because of it and them killing to, cover up their dishonesty. And I'm like, that's happening to a great degree right now. But even still, in originally watching it, it was a scary concept to be like, holy shit, what if, cops were not, here to help you?
Absolutely.
And it's something that as a kid, I'm like, that's scary, but like, that's something that's a reality for a lot of people of color now, that I'm sort of like, holy shit. Like it's a fear that as a kid I looked at and I was like, man, wouldn't that be scary? Oh my God, thank God we don't live in a time like that. And I'm slowly realizing, like, oh fuck, we do live in a time like that. But I feel like there was just a lot of it that was creepy and stuff that I just never really thought of before. But yeah, it really, Tales from the Hood really had an effect on me. And that being, it's one I revisit. I haven't watched it in probably, I'd say, probably 2 years. Mm-hmm. I think the last time I watched it was when we reviewed it, actually, on Mitchoy Chats. I don't remember when I don't remember the exact date of when we did it, but
it was a minute.
Right, it's been a while. We did a video episode, and we reviewed it then. But I remember even still, just like viscerally, like it was very jarring to watch it again, because I feel like it's still held up. There are moments of silliness, sure. I mean, it was made in '95, so I mean, you take that with like the immense, chunk of salt that was white guilt at the time, watching a movie like Dangerous Minds and things like that. That was your basic understanding of what was going on with people of color at the time, was, well, just show them Dangerous Minds, and then we'll show them that we understand their plight and their suffering and their the things that they go through. But I don't know, Tales from the Hood was always one that just creeped me out. And I think about it, there are moments, even seeing a wildly racist Corbin Burnson, all of it would just it just all sat right with me. Like, you watch it and you're like, all right, this is creepy, this is cool, this is fun. Even watching the trailer is like, where your fears meet in the street, and I'm like, we need to stop. You need to stop doing this. They need to stop making trailers like this. But overall, I feel like it's one that it's a movie that should be experienced at least once in your life, just to be like, all right, I saw Tales from the Hood. There might not have been great segments, but there were some good segments. Mm-hmm. Much like, I feel like the VHS franchise.
Okay.
I mean, you always kind of get that with anthologies. Tales from the Hood is definitely at least the original is definitely one of the better done anthologies.
Yeah, I would encourage anyone who hasn't seen it already to check it out and have a little fun with it. But that's one that's definitely on my top 5 of formative horror movies, I guess the term would be.
Sure.
Okay. I'll have to check that one out again. Yeah, I think you guys must have talked about that even way before I was.
No, I wasn't before. That was when we were doing we were messing around with some video stuff.
Oh, okay.
And so we reviewed it on there.
Yeah, I'll have to check it out again. For sure.
Yeah, definitely.
That awkward moment when Mike DeJoy is like, yeah, that was done a long time ago. Like, no, it's only a couple of years ago, but we didn't care about telling you about it. So
we did it yesterday.
But all right, does anyone want to go for number 4? Because I'll throw out one for number 4 if you guys
go for it.
All right. Well, I have a feeling that these last 3, one of these is going to be on your list, one of your guys' lists. So I'm going to throw out one that I don't think either of you are going to really know or give a shit about. This is a little ditty called Waxwork from
I know that one.
1988. That one, and again, that's from, back in a time when I didn't understand that horror movies could be silly or self-aware. Because, like, even looking it up, like, you look it up on Wikipedia, and the first sentence that they have is this comedy horror film. And I'm like, it's not comedy horror. Like, I feel like I'm always jumping, like, to my own defense of, like, it's not comedy, all right? But, like, and I feel like the only things, like, the effects work, terrifying. I'm like, watching it now, I'm like, it's silly because, like, they play on all these expectations of horror movies. But
Absolutely.
as a fucking, like, 9-year-old watching this movie, I'm like, this is horrifying. This werewolf tearing this guy in half, fucking these vampires, like, chaining this dude down and eating him. I'm like, it is fucking scary. Like, and then there's other shit that I don't really remember from the movie that, like, watching it again, I'm like, okay, like, I didn't realize that it stars the kid from friggin' what is it, Gremlins?
Oh yeah, sure does. Zach,
Again,
whatever his name is.
Zach.
Galligan.
I almost said Zach Galifianakis, and I'm like, I know that's false.
That's not right.
But it's a goofy flick. Like, even watching it, like, there are moments that I think of now, the last time I watched it, which was like at least 5 years ago, where I'm like, all right, that's kind of campy and lame. And that was 5 years ago. So I can only imagine what it would be like if I watched it now. But I will never forget being so terrified thinking about the whole scene involving vampires, the whole scene involving the werewolves. There's a clown at one point, like, and then all of them come out of, like, the whole setup for this is there's a waxwork in town, and a waxwork is just like a Madame Tussauds, like, wax museum, basically. And it's just all these different horror scenes. And the whole trope was if you went past the velvet rope, you would go into the horror scene and you would have to, like, escape the werewolf or escape the vampire that was being, displayed. And they normally, most of them met with violent ends and then would become a part of the wax diorama. But it's just a silly flick that, like, you think about now and you're like, all right, this is goofy as hell. But, 9-year-old kid watching it, you're like, this is horrific.
Well, that's the whole thing. Like, when you watch it too, because
exactly.
It's a very different landscape of, like, what, like, a lot of kids watch now. And like I mean, so we watched Evil Dead when we were 10, 11. You said, Mike, or like 9 or 10.
Yeah, I was. I was 10 years old. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean that's young. I mean that's pretty young. So, like, watching these movies, because some of it is like that effects work. Because it's done, like, without all that digital nonsense, honestly, for the most part. And that's something that didn't really translate super well into, like, horror. Some people have done it, like, kind of like implemented it in, like, an effective way, but that's something that just never really took off as much in the horror genre. So when you see a lot of these movies from the 80s, 70s or whatever, and you see those effects at a young age, I mean, that movie's going to have a certain, it's going to do a certain number on you, as opposed to, like, maybe watching it now or, where you look back, it's like, oh, waxwork, like, that's one of his favorites. It's like, yeah, but, like, look back at when, you're watching that and what that does to you.
Exactly. I feel like that's the whole idea. I feel like, look at the age, look at the time, look at the location. Like, when you guys were talking about, like, Mitchoy, when you mentioned, like, well, we lived in the woods and, Evil Dead takes place in the fucking woods. So, like, you're looking at your window and you just see trees. It's going to be scary. You're going to think about that. Like, there are these little moments where it taps into things that you didn't think about. And then all of a sudden you're at home and you're like, oh God, this is terrifying.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, waxwork, it's one that, like, I was a kid and, like, you watch it now and you're like, this is silly. This is fun. And it is. And you should check it out if you haven't seen it. But, like, as a kid, just think about it through a kid's eyes, of, like, 9 years old, going, oh my God, this is the most terrifying thing I've ever seen.
I'll have to revisit that one again too. That sounds like it'd be a fun Halloween one to watch.
Honestly, I feel like if your goal is, like, goofy Halloween flicks, I feel like you'll watch that and within 5 minutes be like, okay. All right.
Absolutely.
I see where you're coming from, Frank.
Definitely.
Cool.
Well, yeah, Waxwork is the one for me, boys.
All right. What do you think? What do you think, Mike? You want to go? You want me to go?
Yeah, you go.
All right. So speaking of, watching stuff around Halloween time, I'm going to throw out one of my absolute favorites to watch around Halloween time, and that would have to be Fright Night.
Wow.
Yeah.
Great.
I'm giddy for Fright Night. Like that to me is like, if I would even say if I can have only one movie to watch on Halloween, it would be Fright Night. And
I couldn't even disagree with you. Like, just thinking about the story. Like, but please go ahead.
Fright Night always, like, for me, like, and it's something that grew on me more and more as I got older, actually. It wasn't necessarily one of those movies I watched, like, the first time I watched it. It was like, I mean, it's very nostalgic watching it now because of when I did watch it. I had a lot of fun watching it. But it's a movie that just grew on me more and more as time went on. And it almost, for me, it almost plays as a sort of adult version of Monster Squad. Obviously without like the novelty of having all the Universal monsters in it, but it kind of always played as an adult Monster Squad for me.
I could definitely give you that.
And just the setup of it was so fun. The music, it was like scary and funny and sexy and all of these things all together. That I'm just kind of like captivated by. Like, there's such like a Halloween-y atmosphere to that movie. Like, it just has all of those like sort of genres thrown. I mean, obviously it's a horror movie through and through, but it has like all those like little genres sprinkled throughout, like fun, quirky characters with just a really fun plot of there's a vampire living next door. You know, and I feel like that's almost all you really needed back then, where it's like, we're going to make this movie about this, teenager who's really into like watching Peter Vincent vampire movies. And he's going to eventually find out that there's a vampire that moves in next door to him. And all these like strange happenings start occurring. And he like starts to get like all investigative about everything. And then he brings like the whole brilliant twist of bringing Peter Vincent in. And then he's just like, he's more scared than ever and doesn't believe any of it. Like, it's just such a fun back and forth of like that was like the fun little twist with the movie. And then the end of the movie, it winds up turning into almost like this real better looking version of what Peter Vincent's doing on TV.
Exactly. Oh my God. Like, honestly, like, I had a backdoor into this movie. Because there was, I don't know if anyone has ever watched the show Are You Afraid of the Dark?
Oh yeah.
There's one episode that deals with this girl who is convinced that there's something wrong with her neighbors because they only come out at night. They only do this, that, and the other thing. So she's convinced they're vampires. And then at the end of the episode, it's like, no, they're not vampires. Their son is a vampire. But like, it's the same sort of idea of like, there's something going on next door and you're convinced of it and no one else is convinced of it. And it's like that classic 80s kids are going to solve it sort of idea that like always will sell me on it. You know what I mean? Like, it's one of those things that like the second that comes up, I'm like, you've sold me. I'm like, let's watch you kids solve this fucking problem. Like, but like when I was younger, I saw that episode of Are You Afraid of the Dark? And then when I was older, I saw Fright Night. And when I saw Fright Night, I was immediately like, the gates are open, my friend. I'm like, come on in. I'm like, this was already great. But
yeah, no, it's a movie that's just it became very near and dear to me. And I just love it's a very seasonal thing too, watching it, but it is my favorite to watch around Halloween time. And I just love, like, again, the vibe of it, the atmosphere of it, the music, the plot, the setup. It's just a fun ride, and like Peter Vincent's like his whole, like, his journey is like a lot of fun to watch in that too. Like,
definitely is.
Yeah. So it was just
very fun characters.
very
Honestly,
fun, but it never it's funny how it never translated to the second one. Like that was, from what I remember, the second one of the most obnoxious things about that was how didn't Peter Mike, you might even remember this, but didn't Peter Vincent almost convince himself that what happened in the first movie didn't actually happen?
Yeah, I mean, more or less because of what was it's Charlie, right?
Yeah.
What he goes through, and he's dealing with a therapist who's trying to convince him that everything's not what he thinks it is, and of course there's no monsters, and they are sort of trying to deal with the trauma of the first one, but the approach is just not great, and unfortunately the real heart of the movie is really the interaction between those two guys.
Yeah.
And kind of lose some of that in the second one, and I understand that you're trying to give a crisis. There's got to be a reason to tell the story, but it could have just been done. I just think better, and kind of the whole thing comes off like a cheaper sort of version of the first one. And in the grand scheme of how bad so many vampire movies are as a subgenre, Friday Night Part 2 is not horrendous, but the first one is just so much better.
Yeah, it's just such a fun ride.
So much more endlessly rewatchable.
Yeah.
It has that it factor. And there are some movies that just have that sort of it factor. And sometimes they're, these sort of B-movie horror classics. Other times they're really terrible movies like The Room that just have this weird appeal that you can't articulate, but something about it is really fucking works.
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes they're big budget Hollywood blockbusters that really work. It's pretty amazing that spectrum does. It's not really limited to a specific type of movie, but Fright Night totally has that, and it's just it's super super fun.
Yeah.
You know what? You sound like you're going down to Hollywood, my friend. It sounds like you're on your way to Hollywood land with that sort of attitude.
Oh, yes, the good old Hollywood.
The good old days of Hollywood land. Let me tell you what. Well, I have to really concur with Mike Joya. I think Friday Night is a fantastic flick. And it's one of those ones that it's got that it factor. I agree with Mike Foy as well. It's just got that something that you watch it and it's greater than the sum of its parts.
All the moving pieces are there. Even Charlie's mother is really, really fun. And I really kind of took note of that too the last couple times I watched it. And you don't see that a lot in we've talked about in 80s movies. A lot of times the parents are very much in the background. They don't really play characters.
Very true.
You see them a little bit here and there, but they're never really a part of it. They just always you look at the gate, the parents just disappeared, and the kids are dealing with almost their kids' version of the Evil Dead.
Yes, very much.
But I do have to stop you and clarify, though. That is a movie specifically where the parents are on vacation. So I understand what you're saying, and I don't. I entirely disagree. But what I'm trying to say is, what you're getting at, I feel is there's a lot of 80s movies where the parents are literally just in the background, as opposed to the parents have left the kids alone to do something. Because I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. Yeah, I mean it's kind of both. It's a lot of times because that's kind of the whole vacation thing. We're going away for a couple days. That's a very the parents are always written like that, where it's they're kind of going away and or again.
It's a function of the script almost, where you're we need to get the parents out of here. They're on vacation.
So they kind of made her a fun character, and I always enjoyed that too. So it's all the characters were just firing on all cylinders, and just a really fun romp of a Monster Squad type movie, and always gonna be one of my favorites. My favorite movie to watch around Halloween time.
Nice.
I love it. I feel that's one of the ones that really pops with a lot of personality. Can I ask you an honest question? Have you seen the remake?
I did see the remake.
And how did you feel about it? Because I feel like anyone who has listened to Mitchoy chats long enough knows that I'm charitable to remakes. But like I was wondering, since you have such a love of the original, like what was your stance on the remake?
You know, I saw it years ago. I think it came out in like 2011. I probably saw it that year, so it's probably been about 10 years. I was ultimately very disconnected from it. You know, like if you're gonna listen, it's not like Fright Night's a movie that could not have been remade.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
You know, I'm coming from a place I'm coming from a very nostalgic kind of place also, and there's just an energy to a lot of those movies that's so much like more on screen and vibrant than I see like horror movies over the past 15 years, especially like I think they've had a bit of a resurgence over the past 10, but I don't really think most remakes just never really kind of hit the nail. And Fright Night was really no different. I mean, it had its moments. It had fun musical cues, actually. The guy who did the score, he does a lot of really cool stuff, actually. I think he does Game of Thrones. So there was some interesting stuff there, but ultimately, like, there's a visual disconnect there. And from what I remembered, like, just the charm and fun of the original was not like there was just such a confidence, like, in the original with like all the characters, all the plot turns, like everything like that. Like that just like the remake just felt like it's a remake. It's the same concept. We're going to kind of do, you know, our own thing. I don't really remember the movie in complete detail, but I definitely do remember being disconnected from it and being like, okay, I'm good on that. So that was kind of like, it's been a while since I've seen it though, for sure.
All right. Well, I mean, I can definitely give you that. I mean, I guess I was just more looking for your basic rundown of how you felt. Because when I originally watched it, I was like, you know, this is not terrible. I feel like if a later generation of kids were to watch this and this was their understanding of Fright Night, I'd be all right with it. You know what I mean? It was not as bad as I was expecting the normal run of remakes to be. And when I saw it, I was genuinely surprised. I was like, no, this is pretty decent. I enjoyed it. But again, it's not like, you know, the be all end all of remakes, but I was definitely surprised that I enjoyed it more than I normally did.
Okay.
But cool. Yeah, that's pretty. I just wanted to get your input on what you thought.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
All right, well, Mike Foy, there's no getting around it now. You got to give us one.
Well, you already brought it up before, so we're gonna go right there. The Gate.
Oh, wow! I would have expected this on Joya's list.
Well, it definitely was. It's not on my list, but it was definitely a consideration.
Sure.
Mike, take it away before we jump into it.
It's the Gate was like the same thing as Evil Dead. Just saw it at somewhere around like 10 years old, and you know, watching that movie alone in my basement playroom, like just totally and terrified. You know, like I'm pretty much the age of that kid in that movie. You know, it's like I'm. You know, there's certain movies you connect with in that way. And they impact you like that. Like the first time I saw Halloween 4, you know, Danielle Harris was, I think she was 10 years old playing 9, something like that. But, you know, like I was like the same age, you know, and there's a lot of horror movies that revolve around kids and kids as a main protagonist.
Much so.
So it really does, even though a lot of the content is not necessarily appropriate for kids of certain ages, of course. It is interesting, like how much, you know, like the concept a lot really of family and children plays into these stories. But it is one of these movies that takes place in this like hard to articulate 80s suburb. It's a very specific look and feel that only exists in like a handful of 80s like horror movies, sort of specifically, where even though E.T. is not a horror movie, that's the same sort of suburb feel. But then you get the same thing in Poltergeist, you get the same thing in The Gate, you get the same thing in Pulse. There's definitely there's something about that. It's got a Slumber Party Massacre 2. It's got a very specific feel, and it feels sort of like new and kind of empty because there's been like a lot of like trees and things knocked down to build the homes, so they almost do feel like cookie cutter and kind of almost fake in a way. So there's something about like the whole look and vibe of the gate that I clicked into, and then it reaches a point roughly around the halfway mark where the kids have gone through all of this crazy shit, and they get a like a ring of the doorbell or whatever, and they've been scared to death. They've seen these little demon things, like the phone is melted and shit. They go to the door, and it's the parents, and the kid runs up to him. He's like, thank God you're fucking home. Like, oh, everything's going fucking haywire. And the parents just start to like laugh maniacally and like start melting, and like it's just fucking insane. And it turns out to be this giant like illusion and misdirection, and like it was so insanely effective on me. Like, I kept watching the movie. I didn't get like scared in the sense that I was going to stop watching it, but I was like terrified, thinking like, hey, like I grew up mostly as a latchkey kid, so I was home alone a lot, and I was an only child, so it was usually for too long at a time, but it was enough that like I definitely understood what it was to be kind of scared in the house by yourself, like just with your dog, and you get a strange knock at the door, and someone's, because like it genuinely doesn't happen so much anymore, but there used to be a lot more people walking around, like solicitors and salespeople and like town representatives. Like there would just be times you'd be at the house, somebody fucking knocking on the door. You're like, what the fuck? And then you wait, and they knock again, and then they keep fucking. You're like, is someone gonna break in the house? And the gate just kind of really pulled that out, like this kids on their own having to figure it out. It's very much like that Goonies sort of mentality, like we're gonna fucking do this shit, but the stakes are in a sense are so much higher, because it's exactly what you said before, Mitchoy, about there being like it's like this tiny ground zero for something that will ultimately destroy everything.
Yeah. And this was like, the gate really was like almost a kid's version of the Evil Dead.
So right.
It's kind of like a kid's version of, they took Goonies and Evil Dead and then put it in a suburb house of E.T. and Poltergeist.
Oh yeah, and it's funny because like the Gate was another one of those movies that like when I originally saw it, I kind of like blew over it a bit. Like I didn't have the same like initial response to it that I guess you did, Mike.
Yeah.
And I think it's because maybe I was just watching a lot of other like evil, like crazy stuff, and I kind of just blew it off in that sense. And then I remember rewatching it years later, and I was like, wow, that was really cool. I mean, that was, it's a little more under the radar, but there's some fucked up stuff in there. There's some really cool elements in this. And I remember telling a buddy of mine who's a massive horror fan, I'm like, I was like, when was the last time you watched The Gate? And he's like, it's been a while, but I don't know, it's not that great though, right? I'm like, watch The Gate again. and
watch the fucking Gate again. How about that?
He
just get your life together and watch The Gate.
Oh yeah, he watches it and calls me up the next day, and he's like, "Dude, I watched it 3 times," and it wound up being like a regular, like rotational, like, movie for him, like just watching it all throughout the year. And we would both go back to it. It's always a movie him and I, like, we go back and talk. We always talk about The Gate. We always find these like little things every time we watch it. And it just wound up being like over time, like one of our favorites. It came close to making my list. So yeah, it really is a cool movie. And I know that doesn't sound like a positive where you say, oh, it's a kid's, like, who wants to watch a kid's version of The Evil Dead? It's not really that simple, but like there isn't like
not that simple. It's a kid movie like that, but it's an adult movie.
Yes,
like
that's a good way to put it.
I was just gonna say, I feel like the phrase should be, it's not a kid's version of Evil Dead, it's Evil Dead with kids.
Yes, that would be a better way. Yeah.
That's a different way of saying it, like, because I feel like that's going to more aptly say what's going on, because it's still visceral. I feel like there are moments in that movie where I still remember. I still remember the eye in the hand. I still remember stabbing it. There are so many moments in that movie where I'm like, nope, don't want to remember it.
Images that absolutely just like burned into my fucking brain. Like when the friend like comes out of the closet and he's now like some sort of a vampire thing.
Yeah.
Creepily behind, and he just like grabs, and the way like the zombie old man comes out of the basement like wall, and he just like demolishes the wall and grabs that kid. Like there's just moments like you're saying with the hand that are just it's partly the graphics design, and there's some stop motion, and it's like it looks unsettling but realistic, but it's so fucking well done and so creepy.
Even the kids having to deal with the dead dog.
Oh my god!
I don't even mean to bring that up really, but that was like another aspect of that movie. Like that's like not something kids should have to deal with really. Like that's a brutal experience, and even like how it happened. So the fact that they even had to figure out how to deal with that was like that kind of like hit you hard too watching that, because you're like, man, I don't even want to deal with that now.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So that was like a rough thing too that you probably wouldn't see in a lot of movies. But yeah, there was a lot of really disturbing things sprinkled throughout that movie.
Absolutely were. Yeah, that was just one of those movies, again, just left that kind of impression on me. I always thought about those images. It always stuck in my brain. You know, it was always a movie I went back to at some point, and I do have the Blu-ray. It's from, I think it's from Vestron Video. It's they did a nice job on it. It's definitely worth picking up.
Okay.
But yeah. So The Gate, another super creepy one. Who's next?
Very much so. The Gate. Good call on you.
Okay.
Well, I'll throw these three that I have here. I feel like it bums me out a little bit to say I feel like they're a little more mainstream and a little more on the radar.
Okay.
But nonetheless, I feel like the impact they had were truly great. So I'm going to grab one and throw it out there just because Mike DeJoya has already mentioned We All Lived in the Woods. And 1999 was a formative time in terms of the amount of movies coming out.
Oh, yeah.
But I, prior to watching some of the horror movies that we've watched for Mitchoy Chats, I was never so scared in my life than I was when I saw the Blair Witch Project.
Okay.
There was something just like it flipped a switch in me of like, this could happen to you. And like, it's so funny because like watching movies like Friday the 13th and like Nightmare on Elm Street, I'm like, well, my parents never murdered a child molester in our neighborhood, so I think I'm all right. Like, you know what I mean? There was this point of like, well, you know, you're fine because this didn't happen and that didn't happen. But then there are moments like Blair Witch Project where you're just like, it doesn't matter because you could still be involved in some shit in some way. And we lived in the woods and it seemed so real. The advertising campaign, I mean, this is stuff we've talked about on the podcast. And if not, I feel like everyone knows about the Blair Witch Project in terms of the advertising campaign and how they made it look like, you know, the actors were actually missing and and it's obviously a found footage horror movie. Not that it's the first one, but it's one of the most successful ones. But it just honestly, like, there were so many moments in that movie that I'm just like, this is terrifying. And I think it's more because so much of it is implied. And it's not even that it seems like it was like, oh my God, they went through some shit. It was like, you don't even really know what they went through. It's just so much of it was just made for such a visceral, just terrifying experience, for me at least, that when I was like 14 years old, I'm like, well, I'm never sleeping again after this. That was it for me. I was like, I live in the woods and I'd rather be dead. But the Blair Witch Project really fucked with me. But
I definitely agree with your choice. That was a super, super creepy movie upon release, and one that definitely got under my skin for a little while.
Yeah, I like, and it's something that, like, I've had conversations with people where they're like, this is not a scary movie. Nothing happens. I'm like, I can't even argue that. I cannot even argue that. Like, you could make the argument nothing happens, but I feel like the other half of it is there's so much implied, and there's so much that if you just take one step further, you're like, I don't want to step any further into this story because it just makes me feel gross and creeped out. Like, and that for me was like, I'm like, that makes a damn good horror movie for me, at least. Like,
Yeah.
it's funny. I was talking to my lady earlier, and we were talking about what should go on the list, and the Poughkeepsie tapes came up, and there was a point where I was like, maybe it should go on the list, because it is very visceral. But I feel like at the end of the day, my brain was like, just because it's very disturbing does not necessarily make it good. Because I think about Inside sometimes, where I'm like, well, Inside was good, but there's moments in Inside where I'm like, well, if you're not an idiot, you wouldn't have done this. And like, you know what I mean? It just makes it automatically like, all right, I don't know if I like this anymore. But in any case, Blair Witch Project will always be one that messed with me on so many levels that I wasn't ready for when I was 14. But
Sure.
It's funny because like I that makes a lot of sense too. But I have to say that was something I never really got into the found footage experiment. Like even when Blair Witch came out, I feel like I wasn't one of those people who walked out and said, well, fuck that. I'm not like I'm not one of those nothing happened kind of people really. Mm-hmm. But I was also just visually turned off by the whole thing. And that's
very much so. I can totally hear you there.
And that comes down to a very subjective sort of viewpoint too, because it was something different. It was something in a lot of ways too. I think like the genre needed something like that, whether it was found footage, something else, but the genre did need something like that. And, I've said a million times, like on this podcast, I've said it, just with friends in private, that visual and look of like the 70s and 80s is always my favorite. And I hold a very nostalgic feeling. It's one of the reasons why 4K is something I cannot embrace. And I've tried it so many times. Obviously, this is not a 4K situation, of course, but there was still like a kind of like visual to it. And I think because like, we were like 14 when that came. By the time I was 14, I had seen so much stuff like your Evil Deads and just like with a lot of the visuals of like the makeup and the gore and the like all that stuff. Like just the look and lack of that in Blair Witch, I think just ultimately turned me off. And I just wasn't really into it. And that wasn't just like something like the Blair Witch. Like I became very, as much as there's lots of movies I love from that time, like once it got into like the late 90s, like I was a little more disconnected from movies that came out around that time. So Blair Witch never really, I think I revisited it like, a couple years later, and it still just didn't really do much for me. It's been a minute since I've seen it at this point. But I get why it would make that list, but it just never, like the found footage. I haven't even seen any Paranormal Activity movie.
Well, that's interesting. You know what I mean? Because like, I feel like there's a sense of the format lending legitimacy to the horror. You know what I mean? Like by the idea of it being found footage, and because I agree with you. There are points in the Blair Witch Project where you're watching it where you're like, you need to stop shaking this camera because I'm gonna fucking throw up. Like, no question about it. And like, it's something that extends to Cloverfield and a handful of other movies where you're just like, A, there's no reason to be recording right now. B, there's no reason to do a number of these things. So there's a point where I reach where I'm like, the format lends legitimacy to the idea of it, and sometimes the shaky cam takes away from it, even though it is more quote unquote realistic. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no,
like,
and
that's what sucks too, because it's like you're watching it and you're like, you want to be creeped out, but the other part of you is like, but I don't want to throw up either. Like, so we got to find a balance somewhere. Like,
sure. Now the second movie, that was a great movie.
All right. Well, this has been Mitchoy Chats, and it's been a wonderful time.
And that's it.
And that's Mitchoy Chats.
Mike Mitchoy is all about that Book of Shadows.
I saw that in the theaters too. Book of
Did you?
Shadows. I saw that in the theaters. Yeah, I don't
Yeah.
remember a thing about it, but
Wow.
yeah, I saw that in theaters.
Gotcha.
I saw everything. I saw everything in the theater, like from that time period. It's funny how I said like around that time period, I was disconnected from a lot of movies, but I found that I would say from like the very late 90s into like the late 2000s, I went to the movies the most.
Sure.
I guess I was just at that age, like I was ready to drive. It's like, oh, I can go see like, all this stuff now. But yeah, okay. Blair Witch Project.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, that is definitely on my list.
Cool. I guess I'm up here.
Yeah.
Three. It's like, yeah, we're waiting.
What the fuck ever? Like,
okay. I am going to throw out. Are you ready?
No. Okay, now I am.
Okay. Hellraiser.
Nice.
oh, all right.
So Hellraiser. This was a strange one. This is another one I watched when I was younger, and this is one too. Like, this is one I even appreciate it more. It's another one I appreciate it more. Not so much like loving more, but like I appreciated this a lot more because Hellraiser came out in 1987, and by 1987 we had gotten. I mean, how many slasher movies, how many Freddy, Jason, and Michael Myers movies have we gotten, like, from like the early 80s, late 70s to 1987 when Hellraiser came out? A ton of them. In addition to like all like the offshoots, your sleepaway camps, The Burning, like all that stuff, like tons of slasher movies. Hellraiser comes around. And now let me preface too by saying I never read Clive Barker's like original like narrative. Like I never read the book, or was it
who has? You know what I mean?
Was it a short story? Was it like a novella? Was it
novella?
Okay. Now,
yep.
So I haven't, from what I understand, there's a lot more detail with that. It's obviously like a better story on the page, and I can totally see that.
Well, it's not necessarily like better. Like most of the details between both versions are pretty damn close to being the same.
Okay.
The main real difference is that instead of Kirsty being Larry's daughter, like they're all around the same age, and she's like a coworker of his or something. Mm-hmm. And I think that the family dynamic actually works better when you like watch it as a movie. Okay. Like the whole thing kind of, I think, plays a little bit better. But that's just my opinion. There's some stuff towards the end of the novella that I do think is interesting and could have been interesting visually in the movie, but the movie is also very low budget, so I'm assuming that there were reasons why some of those things weren't done.
Okay, I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, but it's honestly it's like pretty faithful. It's Clive Barker adapted it himself, so it's pretty close to what he was doing.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I mean, so I watched this movie, and like again, just kind of talking about all those other ones, and I watched a ton of those. I watched all those like slasher movies, Freddy's, Jason, Michael Myers, all that stuff. This movie comes like I watched this movie, and I'm like, oh, this is not a movie about a bunch of teenagers fucking around and just like getting picked off one by one. I'm like, this is a very adult story about like the world of like pain and or pleasure, like what it means to you. It's a story about a very like it's also a very dark love story.
Yeah, it's a story about a love affair.
Yeah, and it had such a maturity to it in addition to some of those I know Mike, you were saying was kind of low budget, but so again, like watching the effects of this movie now, it's just remarkable seeing how well they hold up.
Yeah.
And there was just so much like disturbing imagery in this. Like when I saw it when I was younger, I was like, it's like all these movies I was watching, like even like your Evil Deads and Fright Nights and all that stuff. It's like I have this like smile on my face. I'm like, oh, this is fun. This is wild. And then it's like Hellraiser was kind of like, it was just so. I was like, what is this? It's like. But again, it was that maturity it had to it. I mean, from the moment, like, his, like, Andrew Robinson's blood just like split, and they emphasized so much. Like, that was another thing too. Like, we saw so many graphic things in these movies, but when he cut his hand on the nail, when he was moving the couch, I mean, they got up close and you just heard every piece of skin just kind of like tear open. When the blood spilled on the ground, they emphasized the sound of the blood. It was just almost like absolutely disgusting. And through that, it creates this creature that's rising from the dead, which obviously turns out to be his brother. And from there, it just kind of like propels forward a very twisted like love story.
Agreed.
And I was just so captivated. Like, again, as I appreciated it even more, like narratively, I appreciated it more when, because there was a part of me, like when I was younger, it was always about like that visual aspect, and Hellraiser has that. It has that visual aspect of like, the makeup and like, the kind of work they put into that. But on a narrative level, that's when Hellraiser really started, like, as I got a little older, it really started kind of like hitting me much harder. And it was like, there was not like, because Pinhead's considered one of the, those, modern Universal monsters, along with Freddy and Jason. But I mean, Pinhead was in the movie for a very short amount of time. And it wasn't really about him at all. It wasn't about him just like showing up and slashing a bunch of teens. He was like, he roamed this like dark dimension with these other creatures, these other Cenobites, and like embracing like the pain and pleasures people want to like feel. And it pops up here and there, but like the whole entire movie is really about Julia and Frank and what she does. And even the way she was with Andrew Robinson, like her actual husband in the movie. I mean, she was so disconnected in a very uncomfortable way, to the point where like he knew she didn't love him or didn't want to be with him. It's like it hurt her to be around him, to the point where you almost I don't know about, feeling happy that she was like so in a weird way scared, but thrilled to see Frank and what she would do to bring him back. It's like, that's how like disturbed she was in her own lifestyle, that she was willing to cross that line and do some horrific things just to be done with that kind of banal lifestyle. And it really like, explored that whole dynamic. And it was a very like adult, horror movie to watch, like in a time when by 1987, things got really silly. There was obviously still great stuff, but, again, by that time we had already had so many of each of the other, like, slashers, that it was just kind of like a breath of fresh air, just watching Hellraiser and, taken in like just all of its dark elements.
Totally agree. That was one that almost made it onto my list, because again saw that movie at like 10 years old. That movie definitely left a fucking massive impact.
Sure,
it was close.
Yeah, no, it's a good one. Frank, are you like, have you seen it recently, or?
I have not seen it recently. I've seen it maybe in the last, like, maybe 3 to 5 years. But I remember when I saw it, I was so taken aback by the idea of, like, the things you find pain in, the others might find pleasure in.
Mm-hmm.
And that was such a terrifying concept to me, because I never thought about that as an idea at all. So there are these moments where like this comes up in the movie and you're like, it makes me feel intensely uncomfortable. Like, and thinking about Hellraiser, like in these moments where they talk about like, oh, the pleasures and pains, I'm like, I'm already uncomfortable. I'm like, you've already like walking in, you've already made me uncomfortable,
Yeah, and that's what the whole movie was. Like, I mean, like from Julia, like the way she was around her husband, Andrew Robinson's character, she was always like the whole movie was based around a lot of this like discomfort that she was feeling in her life, like that he was feeling. I mean, there was that discomfort when she first saw Frank until that wound up becoming a pleasurable thing to like be, you know what I mean? So like it played around with so much of that discomfort on like a more grounded level and like that more like horrific supernatural kind of level. And yeah, it just, it went wild with that. And it was really an awesomely like mature horror experience. Like watching that movie.
Very much so.
And it still hits me every time watching that. Like I'm just still captivated by that movie every time. So yeah, it's a good one.
I feel like it's absolutely one of those ones that the more you watch it, the more it just, I feel like mature is the only way to phrase it. Because I feel like it's something that like, it's past the standard, hack and slash nonsense. I feel like it's a step above the normal murdering babysitter nonsense that we come across, or killing teenagers in their sleep or any of that. I feel like there is a sense of maturity to Hellraiser and Pinhead, even if it's trying to mesh itself so deeply in the the Freddys and the Michael Myers of the time. But I feel like it is definitely a cut above, for lack of a better term. Yeah, it does try to do more with the I feel like there are levels of love and lust and I don't know, just something, for lack of a better term, I feel like I keep coming back to mature. I feel like that is the only way to phrase it, honestly.
Yeah. No, that's one of the things that draws me to it the most. And again, it takes that effect a lot too, because it was the first of, it was the first entry, whereas like by 1987, I think we had 4, 5, 6 Jason movies, close to the same with like, the other ones. So this one just kind of like hits hard, and it's like, this is something completely different. And then that's something too that I loved about, I mean, it's a different movie, of course, but I loved that about the Evil Dead remake. I loved that it wasn't just a bunch of, yes, it was a bunch of teenagers, young adults, but it wasn't about them just fucking around and being douchebags.
Mm-hmm.
There was a much more grounded, like serious element to like what was, to the whole entire movie. So I really appreciated that with this one. And it just kind of like, that one hits me a lot more as I've gotten older too.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I am. So you're saying that Hellraiser 3 with the CD shooting Cenobite, that's not as high on the list for you?
Higher.
Okay. All right. I'm just making sure that you're prioritizing properly.
Hellraiser Evolved.
Okay. All right. Just making sure. Because, like, really, like, this is a mature story, but really, you need a Cenobite shooting CDs at people to really get the point across that it's the 90s and this is Hellraiser.
Absolutely.
Well, Mike Foy, we need a number 3 from you.
Then I'm going to give you the original Dawn of the Dead.
Well, you're not going to believe this, but F. Mitty had that on his list as well.
Nice.
Okay.
Mike Foy, I need you to educate me. Talk to me. Why does this speak to you?
I've definitely talked about this multiple times on the podcast over the years, but the end of the day, I stayed with my cousin Scott in his apartment in New York City when he was a police officer in Manhattan, and there was like this video store like a block and a half from where he lived, and it was like a deli type place, and they had like a whole like video section or like whatever, and we rented that night. He's like, I'm going to show you some movies. I'm like, okay. So he rents Chud and Dawn of the Dead.
Oh my god.
That was a double bill. We watched Chud, Cannibalistic Humanoid Underground Dwellers, and then followed up by Dawn of the Dead. And it was just an insane night where my mind was blown by watching these two movies. And like, I wish there was more Chud in Chud, but Chud was like pretty fucking wild, and it was cool to see it for the first time in New York City, where it takes place. But then seeing Dawn of the Dead after that, that movie just like blew my fucking mind. I was like, what is this? This is incredible. And it just couldn't get enough after that of zombies for God, several years. I don't know. I was probably like a good 6-year span after that. I watched all the rest of the Romero movies and just, kind of branched out into these, different movies. Of course, you got in, Return of the Living Dead's in there and like all that type of stuff. But it just really, it just completely blew me away. And I just loved everything about it. I loved the setting and the characters, and like the fact that it had something to say. Like I didn't know exactly all those little nuances the first time I watched the movie, but I certainly recognized that there was something deeper here, and it just was, really fucking well done. And like, all the effects are so wild, and like it's kind of comic booky in a way, or a little cartoonish in a way, but in a way that's self-conscious of that, and is having a really fun time doing it. And it really is, to this day, remains one of the most just ultimate zombie movies.
Well, that movie is also one of the things I love about Dawn of the Dead is how relentless it is.
Oh, yes.
That movie hits the ground running. Like, even though, like, I thought one of the coolest aspects of that movie, like once they get to the mall especially, I loved like the process of how they had to like lock down the mall. Like, how are we going to stay safe? Like, they had to essentially like barricade themselves in and create a home. And the whole process of them doing that, like, that was a good portion of the movie. So it wasn't just about like, again, watching that movie at a young age, like that was some of the goriest stuff I ever saw. So you had that stuff in there, but you had a lot of like awesome character stuff in there where you had to actually see, because, now they're in the mix of it, like Night of the Living Dead, like, no one knows what's going on. It takes place in like a farmhouse for the most part. Now we kind of like expand the horizon a little bit, like how far this has reached, like what's going on. And you see these people get together and like see what they have to do in order to, try to like shelter themselves from like what's going on. And that whole process I thought was really awesome in that movie.
Agreed.
And it was all part of that like relentless nature. I mean, like I love the way they closed down that mall, like just getting the trucks, like swinging them around, like running this way, like closing this. It was a very cool thing. And I liked how Romero spent time with that. It wasn't just like a quick thing. Like, he actually showed you how they had to survive that. So the movie just never stopped.
Yeah. For how long it is, it's pretty amazing. It does. You don't really feel that length of it. I mean, it's an incredibly engaging movie, but like all that process is incredibly important. And it's like, if this was a real situation and a real scenario, like, how would you survive? What are you going to do? Are you going to be able to trust people? What happens when you have, people who have now gone rogue and or they're part of a gang or they're part of whatever, and they're just going to come in and take your shit. Like,
and that is something, like, you are so right. Like, that is something like that is why I put it on this list. There are 2 bullet points that I have for this movie. Dawn of the Dead, 1978. Bullet point 1, elevator intestine scene burned in my brain.
Incredible.
That moment where there are zombies that just burst into that elevator and rip that guy apart and start eating his intestines. I was not ready for that. This was a movie that my mother bought it at Suncoast Video. It was a 2 VHS set. And she bought it and she goes, "Oh my God, this is one of the best zombie movies of all time." And I'm like, "All right, well, you're my mother, so you got to be right." Right? And I'm like, "Let's do it." and it was a day I was playing Pokemon on my fucking little red Game Boy, my Game Boy Pocket. And I kept looking up and looking back and looking up and looking back. And there are scenes that I saw in this movie that were fucking terrifying. Things that burned in my fucking brain. like it just things that I won't forget. And most of them are effects related, like when the helicopter chops off the one zombie's head or parts of the zombie's head. Like there's that. There's, and there's so many moments in the movie that are overall just like visceral. And honestly, now thinking back, looking at it, the idea when I was younger, I'll never forget the idea to me that, other humans are coming in to ruin this for humans. That doesn't make any sense. Bikers are coming in to ruin this for the humans that are there at the mall. That doesn't make any sense. That wouldn't happen. And fast forward to today's political landscape where nobody gives a fuck. And yeah, I could totally imagine bikers coming into a mall and being like, fuck you, who cares? I don't care if zombies are going to kill you. I want to come in and check out your shit. Go fuck yourself later. Like
he says it in the movie. He's like, these guys have probably been surviving on the road through this entire thing. They just stop places, they get what they want, they grab what they need. They're in large numbers. It's easy for them to take out most zombies. And they do take out a shit ton of them before they're eventually mostly overrun. But they definitely, when they burst into that mall, they know what they're doing. Like they are like street professionals. I mean, it would be terrifying. But this idea that just because there's some sort of a global situation like this, that people would just automatically band together, there's no guarantee of that.
Right. And it's such a nice idea, but it's just it won't be the case.
In the genre, there's certainly movies that explore people, and or groups in some of these movies working together. And that's going to happen, of course. But this idea that everyone is just going to, decide that they want to all get along. Well, it's no, Bob wants to be king, so he's going to be king of of the rat people who have taken over the sewers and whatever, and in this apocalyptic landscape.
King of the fucking chud.
Yeah, and then they turn into chud people. I mean, it's just interesting to see.
The tale is old as time, honestly. The tale is old as time.
To see how those things are played out, and how the personal egotistical politics make or break things.
No, you're absolutely right. I feel like it's this level of whoever has this mentality of whoever has the bigger club is gonna win the day, and they're like, yeah, I guess, but there's this moment of fucking zombies are out there. We should try to do something where we're at least banding together, or at least communicating a little. It's fucked. Watching a movie like this, where you're I could see how it could degrade so fast.
Yeah, but it's the other thing though. Dawn of the Dead is opening up already. Several weeks, over a month into this thing. Things are getting bad, really fucking bad. And then by the time that movie ends, you're 8 months into the apocalypse or something.
Honestly.
We're 7 months into the apocalypse, because Fran goes from being, just finding out essentially that she's pregnant to, pretty close to term. So, the course of that movie is a long period of time. And that gang, they don't encounter them for a long time. And that also makes sense. Numbers, continue to dwindle. People start to hide, because they initially are fighting back, but then there's confusion and blah, 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 blah. But then you wind up with survivors hiding for a while. You've got people like the gangs who would take over the streets, who would, do that sort of thing in order to survive themselves. So it all sort of does make sense. And Romero just was really great at least with that initial trilogy of Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, and even the Night of the Living Dead 1990 remake that he did with Tom Savini.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, man, that movie obviously just left such an impression, and forever burned into my brain.
Right. And there are those things that there are those, if you were to look at these lists, you'd be like, oh, Dawn of the Dead, wow, really hot take that it's one of the best horror movies ever. But no, it really is though. And here's why.
Yeah.
It's still visceral. It still leaves an impression when you watch it.
It's all about that time and place you see it.
Honestly, it's a very true point.
Frank Mitchell, I'm curious what the other movie on your list is that you think one of us has.
Oh, well, this is my last movie on my list because we've already gone through Waxwork, Dawn of the Dead, and Waxwork, Dawn of the Dead, Blair Witch Project, and Tales from the Hood. So
right.
This is my last movie here.
All right.
And this is one again. I think about it and I'm like, Frank, you want to have a unique list. I'm like, but you also want to be true to yourself, true to the movies that affected you. And I had so much trouble going into my basement after seeing Suspiria. I saw Suspiria when I was 13. It was one they were showing it on Sci-Fi, if I remember correctly. Oddly enough, and it was later in the evening they were showing it, and it was one of those ones we were scanning channels, and my mom was like, "Oh man, this is a great horror flick," and we watched the last half hour of it, and that was the first experience I had with Suspiria. Was the last half hour.
Wow.
Anyone who's seen Suspiria knows that one of the taglines of Suspiria is the only thing more terrifying than the first 80 minutes of Suspiria or the last 12 or something like that.
Yeah.
But that was a movie, there are lines from that movie that I'll never forget. There are moments from that movie that I'll never forget. And all in all, you watch it now, it seems pretty tame by today's standards when you watch it. It's a slow burn of a movie. It ends with stuff that you could be like, this could be taken care of within a half hour of 2022 movie time. Instead of almost 2 hours of movie time trying to get across this idea of, well, it's not just one witch, it's a whole bunch of witches. And you're like, oh, okay. The movie trying to get that whole idea across to you. It's it takes such time and such delicacy in getting there that by the time it does, you're terrified that anything is going to happen. But
is it as long as the remake? Because the remake's really long, right?
The remake is very long. It's not as long as the remake, if I remember correctly. I don't know offhand how long the original is, but it's one that if you watch it by today's standards, you're like, all right, this is we could get through this a little sooner. But again, it's just something that the music and sound effects. And again, I'm not saying anything new by relating this to you guys and being like, hey man, the music of Suspiria was really scary. Because who the fuck hasn't said that before? But as a 13-year-old living in Ringwood, New Jersey, it was fucking terrifying trying to go into my basement to do laundry when I knew that.
Did you feel like Kevin McAllister in Home Alone when every time he went down to do his laundry? And the furnace was
worse, because at least in Home Alone, there's one where he says "shut up" to the furnace. Well, I'm like, all right, I could say that to my furnace, but I can't say that to the hell that might be behind the door of my best friend with fucking sewing needles jammed in her eyes or something like that. So it was just, it was horrifying to think about, and the music didn't help, and it was just one of those things that just it was a indelible mark on me. Totally. As a young person, especially, I'm like, it's one of those ones that I'm like, there's no way past this. This is terrifying.
Nice.
But yeah, now I pose the question to Mike DeJoya and Mike Foy.
Mike and Joy, how many do you have left?
I have 2 left.
All right, so you go first.
Okay. I am going to go with, as Frank just talked about, a very terrifying one. I am going to go back to another one of my absolute favorites to watch around Halloween.
Ernest Scared Stupid. It's Ernest Scared Stupid, right?
Gonna sort of piggyback off of Dawn of the Dead a little bit here. And
Return of the Jedi.
Return of the Living Dead.
Nice.
All right. I love it.
Return of the Living Dead. This movie is a blast from start to finish. And this is another movie that has a pretty unrelenting pace.
Definitely.
And this movie, at this point too, we had I don't know if it was released the same year, but I don't know if it came out after Day of the Dead. They both came out in '85.
Yeah.
But after kind of like George Romero put his trilogy out, it's like they decided to do something else, and I really enjoy the fact that they didn't make a sequel, but they almost made this sort of like this almost like they made mention of Night of the Living Dead, and they just kind of took that concept and they really just had a lot of fun with it in like one of the ultimate horror comedies of the 80s. And one of my favorite aspects of this movie, because we've seen, so like at that point we saw a lot of movies where you get bit by a zombie and you turn, and maybe you turn within like a day, 2 days, whatever, you turn right away. This movie had played around with these 2 guys who get exposed to this toxin, and the entire run of the movie was this agonizing transformation. From the moment they get, and it's funny because like it's a straight up horror comedy, but what the 2 of them go through up until the moment that they become actual zombies was pretty horrific. And
oh my God, yeah.
I thought the both of them did such a wildly good job of that whole entire process. Meanwhile, there's like just tons of other stuff going on. The movie really they must have storyboarded the movie like so well, because it really does have that. It feels like everything they wanted to do with that movie, they did with that movie. And like all the cool, like fucked up things that happened in the movie, it's like they talked about it and they just put it on the screen. From like, they get exposed. They call the manager, they call the owner. They try to, they try covering everything up. Now they have to go to the guy to burn everything. And that winds up causing like more zombies to come. And then the whole self-awareness of the zombies, once they finally like come to, was just a ton of fun to watch. Like how they were just kind of like conning all these cops and ambulance people to come to the, to come to the morgue so they can keep like attacking them, keep eating them. It was just such a fun concept. Like, like Dawn of the Dead, Night of the Living Dead, they gave us a sort of like terrifying look at these zombies. And we got that too with Return of the Living Dead, but they had so much fun with like this other angle that they took that I was always so captivated by watching this movie. And this is one I revisit a lot. And again, just from all like the plot turns and all that stuff, and the zombies coming, and I still love the whole the torso zombie, like on the metal slab, and she explaining to them how the brains make the pain go away. It's like, oh, that's a great explanation. I like that. But yeah, it was a really fun movie. Just a lot of fun, colorful characters and vivid situations, and just absurd nonsense with all the zombies, and it all ends in just an explosion. Like I love the fast-paced nature of everything, and then boom, all dead. It's just like, that's it. That's the movie. And it was just such a fun, like from point A to point B ride. So yeah, it's not like the most terrifying movie, but again, like it's one of my favorites to watch around Halloween. One that I grew up with, one that I just love more and more every time I watch it. And that's another near and dear Halloween viewing experience for me.
What's so wild is I've never seen that one.
Oh, really?
I've never seen it.
That's a fun one to check out.
So it looks like I'm going to have to write this one down to check out.
And they get really good too. Once you get to Return of the Living Dead 4, 5, 6, and 7, they get even better. They just get much better.
I don't know how I feel about you saying this to me, but I feel like it's bullshit. But I'm going to go forward thinking it's not. And then when I'm confirmed that it does, you're fucking dead to me. All right? So
once you get to Return of the Living Dead, Rave from the Grave,
I might just kill myself. I might just kill myself right there.
It starts really coming into its own. No, but the first one's like really awesome. It's a really great movie.
Well, I'll have to check it out.
You should definitely check it out.
Mike Foy.
I would have to say I'm going to go with Tremors. Because Tremors is it's horror, it's comedy, it's adventure. It's a lot of different things wrapped into this fun package. It's got a really fun cast, and I remember so vividly the first time I watched it. And again, it's another one I've definitely mentioned on the podcast before, but I saw Tremors 1 and 2 in the same day, and I just loved them so much. But the first one definitely takes the cake, and it's just endlessly rewatchable. It's a great little fucking monster flick. And
it is.
It's the combination of the practical effects and the style of how they choose to shoot around what they can't, do with, what would eventually be CGI. And, I've seen the result of CGI on the Tremors franchise. Like eventually, I maybe it was a year ago, I finally saw like Tremors 3. I was like, ugh, I guess let's watch this. And it was so bad. The second one, at least it's still got Fred Ward and it's still got Bert. And there's still some good stuff there. And it's an enjoyable movie. It's not it doesn't feel like a Sci-Fi Channel, movie. And the third one 100% feels like that. And it's unfortunate to see where a lot of these different franchises, spin off or spiral into. But there's just nothing quite like a great fucking little monster flick. It's like the remake of The Blob from '88. I saw the original Blob first as a kid, and I was like, oh, yeah, I like this movie. This is cool. And I do like that movie for what it is even today. But it's a very specific type of movie made from the 50s. And the whole style of it is very just of the time. So to see something that was so much leaner and meaner in the 80s, I was like, this is fucking wild. And there was a lot of interesting sort of monster remake stuff happening in the mid to late 80s, moving into the 90s, and then Tremors just it's this sweet spot in 1990. It came out, I think, in January, the end of January, I think, in 1990. It's just so well done, and again, can't use that word enough. Just endlessly rewatchable. I don't know how many times I've seen it, but I've just never gotten tired of it. And it's got Victor fucking Wong in it.
It is an absolutely joyous movie from beginning to end, because one of the things I loved about talking about a lot of creature features. This is Tremors is a good example of explaining why creature features are they just don't work as much now. And I think it's because, same with disaster movies, they try to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And every time they get bigger, they get worse, they get dumber and much more ineffective. And Tremors is a movie that one of the reasons why Tremors works so well is because of the entire cast.
Mm-hmm.
That movie, like you get it's a small town, obviously. Like you get a sense of every single you get a sense of every single character within 10 minutes of that movie. It doesn't feel forced. It doesn't feel rushed. They all have like, even when they, Victor Wong's like, story, even when they're all there for the first time, you get a sense of how much they know each other, how much they like, they can bullshit with each other. They can yell at each other. They can like shit talk each other. They can, you know what I mean? Like it's a very, you see how they all function in this small town. And there's just such a perfectly painted picture of all of them within the first 10 to 15 minutes of the movie. And it makes like them dealing with this situation so much more fun and so much more interesting. And you don't get that in a lot of like those creature features anymore. And it was, it's just such a cool movie. It's easily one of my favorites.
Yeah. I think Fred Ward and Kevin Bacon had such great chemistry.
Yeah.
Sometimes, again, like a movie has that it factor, and Tremors was one of those movies. All the different pieces just kind of come together, and it's not a perfect movie, but it's a perfect movie for what it is, because it hits, it fires on all cylinders.
100%.
And that fucking, creature feature, design. I mean, like, again, like there were so many of these sort of throwback like 50s remakes, which are cool. But to see something like Tremors where you're like, what the fuck is this monster? Like, it's just, oh man. Like, I love the range that's, I mean, this type of range is in a lot of different genres of movies. But horror has such fun subgenres. And I just can't get enough of. It's amazing to get the thrills and the scares and the chills and the laughs.
Yeah, no, it's a great movie through and through. It's a good choice.
What you got one left?
I do have one left. Yes.
Throw it out there, son.
I am going to throw it out there. I'm going to go. So I'm going to go super mainstream with this one. And I am going to say Poltergeist.
Nice.
Poltergeist is absolutely amazing. One of the aspects I really loved about this, when we talked about before about like, sort of like how you see parents in the background, or they're written in the background, or we have a trip to go on, so they go on this trip, and they're very vague, like in the lives of like the kids and the children. This movie was the opposite, and the family dynamic in this movie made for such a compelling piece as far as like what else was going on like throughout the entire film. And you had such like, even talking about Tremors, like you talking about all these like great character moments, like getting to know all the characters, like getting to know like their personalities. They have these very natural, dynamic personalities. And this was like the whole like first quarter of Poltergeist, like really getting to know this family and like what they were going through. Like Jo Beth Williams was absolutely like, I think she should have been nominated for this movie.
She was great.
And what they were like getting to know them that much, even that moment where like, her and Craig T. Nelson are in the bedroom and they're just like hanging out and they're just like smoking pot. Like there's a very like, almost like very refreshing nature to that dynamic with like, when you see like divorce rates so high and you just see a very disconnected nature with like husbands and wives, it was very cool to see that in this movie, and obviously it lended itself to like, what they were going through, as the, Carol Ann disappears and, they're trying to figure out what's going on. And it was just a really cool, like, I always loved the way Poltergeist kind of started. It really had a very confident beginning, middle, and end. And it's something we don't see a lot, like, like this whole family dynamic inside of a very horrific situation.
Yeah.
And they played it so beautifully in this movie, actually. And then, yeah, I mean, I know this was like, and it's funny too, because this was like the team up of this movie too, Tobe Hooper and Steven Spielberg.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, like, I feel like you could have just thrown those names out and been like, yeah, we're going to have Tobe Hooper direct a Steven Spielberg, produced movie. It's like, oh, well, it doesn't matter what it is. Just make that happen. But it's funny because like I almost had Texas Chainsaw Massacre on this list. Part of me almost wanted to put it on this list because when I saw that movie for the first time, I was like, okay, this is not a movie. This actually happened.
Right.
And like I felt very dirty about that too. I'm like, I'm pretty sure I just watched a snuff film. And it was just interesting to see like Tobe Hooper, like 8 years later, put forth one of the other great horror movies, but like super mainstream. And yeah, I mean, I just always love that dynamic of Poltergeist and seeing them kind of like, trudge through this entire situation. And I thought it was just a fun, wild, mainstream ride. I always try not to go so much for the mainstream stuff, but like, mainstream stuff also 70s and 80s was a little different. Like a lot of the mainstream stuff back then, it really was great stuff, because it was being done for the first time. We never really saw stuff like that. So Poltergeist kind of like really hit me hard in that sense. And it's just such a fun movie. It's a scary movie. Again, another movie where the characters are just all so great together. Just like in the fun moments, in the terrifying moments. And yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's still a great movie. I like the second one. I think the second one's got some fun stuff in it, but the first one is hands down just fucking fantastic. That guy fucking rips his face apart, man. Holy shit! That never let that visual go. And when that meat starts like deteriorating, like it's all just so creepy.
And this was before PG-13 too, wasn't it? I think this was this was still considered a PG movie.
Yep.
Yes,
yeah,
very much.
This is when the PG-13 debate was really like raging, and it was Gremlins that ultimately like set it over the edge because like how the fuck do we market this movie? They're like this can't. They're like it's not quite an R, but you're not having like graphic sex scenes and all kinds of like really violent stuff, but this is uncomfortable, and that there was that, and there was Red Dawn. The two movies that really like finally pushed for them to start divvying up some more ratings, which ultimately does make sense. I mean, you can't just have Jaws be like a G-rated movie, which I think it is. And if it's not a G movie, it's like a PG movie. Like it's just parental guidance, whatever. It's like people are being eaten graphically.
Yeah, very, very, very weird stuff in that. Like looking back, like even though PG-13 wasn't around at that time, it's still just strange to look at that movie and think like and think PG. And that was stuff that people were seeing. I'm sure a lot of kids were seeing that stuff too. And just such captivating stuff to watch. Like Poltergeist was. This is another one too. My another buddy of mine. He showed his girlfriend this for the first time, and she was floored by it. She's like, "This is." She was just like, and she's into a lot of that stuff, but this one just kind of like escaped her. And he had so when he rewatched it after not seeing it for a while, and it was like kind of like, hey, that's like a really, really good movie. Not just in the sense that it's scary, but again, like you cared every step of the way. Like you cared about everything those characters were going through. And he did such a great job establishing them in the beginning. And it just made it like, even though it was a very mainstream kind of experience, like you just still felt that terrifying nature because of how well established they are, how well likable they were, not individually, but just how well likable they were as a family. They just had a very natural like dynamic. And it just made the whole experience that much more like captivating to watch.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
It's a great choice.
It's good stuff.
All right, well, we're up to the last movie.
Damn right.
So my final movie is a fairly obvious one if you know my movie history, and that would be Tales from the Crypt Demon Knight.
Oh man, tell me more.
I remember the first time that I rented the movie and watched it, and then I quickly bought it afterward, and just I still have that tape. I wound up actually getting it signed by Dick Miller, which was pretty fun. But that tape is beat to shit, and it still plays. But it's one of the movies I've just seen the most. Me and my buddy Dan in particular, we used to always just have that on. Whether we were just watching it, we would just put it on in the background. The visuals in that movie, the casting, the choice of the design for the demons, and then the actual effect work of all of the demon stuff is really gross and really unsettling. And there's a moment where you have Billy Zane playing the Collector, who is outside this old abandoned, not abandoned, but it was an old decommissioned church, and he starts raising these demons up from the ground, and it's at first you're like, what is happening? You're not really sure what's up. He's cutting the inside of his palm. There's blood, and it's green, and he's kind of throwing it around, and then these things start to come up, and at first you're like, oh, that's kind of silly. What is this? And then, but when they quickly grow into these full-size demons, and they were absolutely fucking terrifying. And their eyes are just these neon green that just pierces through so many really beautifully darkly lit shots that happen in the film. There's all these different sequences that it's lit kind of vaguely like a comic book, and you have these colors that just really pop, and the demons are hairy and kind of and gross and troll kind of and whatnot. There's random piercings and stuff, and they've got these long fingers. It's all so unnatural, and it works so fucking well. All of this stuff just mesmerized me, and I had loved the show. I actually had been watching the show as a kid before that, with my parents, and I fucking loved it. So seeing this movie was just taking that to that next level. But it just, yeah, I don't know. I think it's a great performance from William Sadler, Billy Zane, Jada Pinkett. I mean, there's just Thomas Hayden Church. There's so many fucking people that pop in this movie. It's just the guy who did the voice of Roger Rabbit. There's a sequence that happens underground in the tunnels where there's just more of this neon green popping out of the eyes, but then it's also in the mouth. They had it's almost like glow sticks or something. It's the way that it glows, and the way everything looks is so unnatural once those demons are there. And it's again, it's the same thing we were saying before. These are implications that will affect everything, and this is the ground zero. And you can't run, you can't go anywhere, and you get dark, and you go outside, and these things are just going to get you. It's so fucking scary. If you really put yourself, in that position. But then it also doesn't take itself too seriously not to have fun. And there's amazing jokes, and that's the best part about a lot of horror movies is this dark humor that can be layered through them, and they can be a through and through horror movie and still be very funny. And there's just moments where all these different characters get amazing lines, and it seems like everybody just had a fucking fantastic time making this. And you get that from a lot of really well made, really great movies, is these people had a fun time putting this together, and they really collaborated, and putting this type of list together really makes you appreciate movies in general, and kind of analyzing why you're really into something.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to say too, like, I have to thank you too for like turning me on to that movie again, because I saw it a long time ago and I kind of just did away with it. Like, I don't remember hating it. I don't remember loving it at all. And I just kind of like moved on from it.
Right.
And it was you and another friend of mine who's really into horror movies. Both of you were like, "Oh, you should rewatch." Kind of like how I was like to my buddy, like, "You should rewatch The Gate."
Right.
That's what I was like, and you need to rewatch Demon Knight again. And I rewatched it, and Demon Knight has become a regular part of my Halloween playlist rotation now.
Fuck yeah.
It's an awesome, it's an awesome, super cool, fun movie. And I feel like too, one of the last, like that was 95, right?
Yep.
So
yeah.
it almost
it was released in like January of 95.
So it like snuck in there, I feel, right before horror kind of took a downfall.
Well, everything was shifting at that point. 95 was a transitional year. So yeah, it's just it's also interesting too, because in the grand scheme of what Tales from the Crypt was sort of known for, Demon Knight is kind of like very much like an outlier as a story, because it's not your typical like morality tale, because that's really what most of the show was. But I think it works in its favor. It's a story that's a way bigger idea, and oh man, some movies that just really well done. When I look at all the things that I've seen and how like seen such great movies and such fucking horrendous movies, and when you see something that is like, to me, the worst movies are just the ones that are boring. It's like, you made a movie, like, you had a chance to do something entertaining, and for you to make something that's like an hour and a half that is just a slog to get through. It's full of a bunch of like pretentious monologues or dialogue or whatever. Like, there's just it's makes you really appreciate something that is just like a wild, fun, crazy ride.
Sure. 100% agreed. No, and that's what that movie was too. It really was a lot of practical stuff in it, just a fun setup, fun characters. Like I said, a lot of practical stuff, and it really was just it was a goof, man. It was a fun movie.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would definitely recommend pretty much every single movie that we've talked about tonight. I think every one of us has had some really fun lists. Yeah,
absolutely. It was a fun one to do.
Honestly, I'm excited that you guys enjoyed this list as much as you did. Demon Knight is one that I have to revisit. I haven't watched that one in a long time.
Oh, okay.
I feel like that's one that needs to come back up on my radar, because I feel like Mike Foy always speaks so highly of it. But I feel like, again, this is an instance of one of those settings of where it's just something that affects somebody so much that you're like, no, you have to check this out.
Yeah.
Past the point of like, it's not even that it's like the earth-shattering film that you think it might be. It's just that it affected somebody so much that you should check it out. And that's really where it begins and ends, I feel like.
Yeah, I would be very curious to get a report back from you on what you thought revisiting Demon Knight.
Oh, I'm sure I'd have a lot of fun with it.
Definitely.
Yeah, that'd be
I think so. All right, boys. This was quite a successful little list making. We have other lists that we've done in the past. You can find all of those at MitchoyChats.com.
Damn Skippy, you can.
So, for Mitchoy Chats, I'm Michael J. Foy.
I am Frank Mitchell.
I'm Mike DeJoya.
And this has been the Top 5 Horror Lists.